And I'm very, very glad to have Alexandre Monnin here and introduce you to him. He is many things, among other things, among other roles. He is a philosopher, an author of books, the scientific director at Origins Media Lab, co-founder of the Closing Worlds Initiative, and he's directing the Master of Science Strategy and Design in the Anthropocene at ESC Clermont BS and Strat École de Design in Lyon. Well, okay, I tried. He did his PhD in philosophy in Paris on the philosophy of the web. Then he focused on the environmental issues of ICT. And now he works on the topic of ecological redirection. And today we're glad to have Alexandre for his talk that is titled Digital Technologies as a Zombie and Obsolete Futures, Alternative Perspective for the Global North. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Start this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having me. So yeah, the title of my talk today is in the digital technology as zombie and obsolete futures, alternative perspective for the global north. I hope I will shed some light on what it actually means. So in a nutshell, to just a few things about the topic of my talk today. I wrote a little abstract. I think it's good to begin with that. Digital technologies still have an image of the future we should and will actually live in. While this future tends to be increasingly described as a dystopian one, not a good one, an additional question needs to be asked. Not only should it happen, but simply, will it happen? And for how long, if it does happen? Some even go as far as to call digital technologies, as we'll see it later, zombie technologies, and I will explain what it means. Will ICT be a prime example of what I call an obsolete future, a future that we're striving for, but maybe ultimately will not entirely happen? On the 1st of July of this year, Ben Reinhardt tweeted that he wondered, and I quote, if 50 years from now, we're going to look back at how we redesigned our world around computers with the same regret that people look back at how we redesigned cities around cars, which of course proved to be a problem today for many, many reasons. Indeed, it is very much possible that we'll only consider the necessity to digitize only once we're a fully digitized society. Hence, how should we rethink ICT's trajectory in the future, especially in the North, where we, of course, have been digitizing a lot, but elsewhere, of course, as well. We'll try to raise and answer some of these questions in this talk. So I will have two parts. First, I will introduce some concepts, practices, and examples. What we are concretely working on, especially with our students in the Master of Science Strategy and Design for the Anthropocene in Lyon. And then I will discuss a possible stance for the global north. So just a few words of context. I published a book with two colleagues last year in May entitled Legacy and Closure, an Ecology of Dismantling. That's a translation because the book is in French. So it's Héritage et Fermeture, une écologie du démantèlement, published by Divergence. And I will also publish a new one, maybe in November, if I'm done. I don't know yet. And part of the talk, of course, is informed by these works. So I want to mention it. A bit more of context. So I am indeed a philosopher, but I've been working for like 15 years in ICT. I did my PhD at the Sorbonne in Paris 1 on the architecture of the web. I was at the time working with people like Harry Halpin, who's like a billionaire now, and Yuki, who's like a great philosopher now. And I've been working at the Centre Pompidou at INRIA, and I was one of the co-authors of the reports written by the Shift project in France in 2000, published in 2018 and 2019 in English, entitled Towards Digital Sobriety. which could have been digital frugality, but anyway. So that was kind of the first, one of the first public reports that's pushed the agenda of looking at the impacts of ICT towards a broad audience. Okay, so when I worked at INRIA, there is an INRIA center here in Grenoble. I don't know if you had time to see it, but it looks like a spaceship. A very vintage, almost old spaceship, but still a vision of the future. So go look at it if you want. I was at the intersection actually between projected digital futures and climate change. I had done my thesis, as I said, on the architecture of the web. I was working also in a knowledge engineering team on the semantic web, the architecture of the web, and connected things. And there was at the time also the realization of the unfolding of the Anthropocene. The COP21 happened in Paris. I was myself acquainted with the work of Bruno Latour, who has been talking about the Anthropocene and ecological questions for quite some time. So came a moment when I asked myself, what will I be working on? I wasn't a postdoc. Actually, I had a bit of a higher position of contractual researcher, a starting research position, as they call it, at INRIA. And the goal was to have me submit an ERC project. So, you know, millions of euros for personal projects. But I was like, should I be working on that, on the architecture of the web again, or knowledge engineering, or the semantic web, or things like that, which are indeed very interesting, but very niche at the same time? Or should I do something else? And I realized I wanted to ask myself first, well, what will be the future of the web? Because if I go to a conference full of computer scientists, and if I go to another conference full of climate scientists, well, the futures are not the same. They were not the same. They are still not the same. It was a time when talking about the impact of ICT was also very much niche and unlike now. So my goal at the time was to imagine what will be the future of the web and ask myself that. And I worked on a project around that. And more broadly, what will be the future of digital technologies in general? Will we have the means to maintain those? I created in 2016 a community group at the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, entitled The Web We Can Afford. So not the web we want, unlike Tim Berners-Lee's web we want, but rather the web we can afford. What web can we afford in the future? So that was 6 years ago, something like that. So I was a bit torn in between, and I came to understand many of the developments in my former research institute has what I called at the time, I began calling at the time, obsolete futures. Their purpose was never fully questioned. Rather, when we debated about anything, that was more about their acceptability, meaning that these projects will happen. But the question was how to convince people that it was a good thing, never questioning the projects themselves, which happens a lot in many different disciplines. It's just like talking about eco-conception without questioning the relevance of a product or a technology, which is very much ill-advised, of course. So my question is, what should we do about these obsolete futures? Futures about technologies that we know will have a hard time to maintain, or even producing them will create more ecological problems in the future, more geopolitical problems in the future, and basically that's a bad idea, or that will make our already difficult situation even worse. So what if ICT is not producing a viable future, futuring, as Australian designer Tony Fry says, but depriving us of a livable future, meaning defuturing, as he also says? Responses from researchers and ecologists, not eco-modernists, of course, even though I do not embrace their positions, often involve one way or another of going back to the past, more communal policies, autosubsistence, the vernacular, you name it. But what does it mean to go back to such a past while we're 7 or 8 billion people, since the conditions that make that fact possible were not present in a distant past? How do we go back while we are collectively attached to contemporary living conditions? And again, what does it mean to go back at all? Is it even possible or feasible? Colombian anthropologist Arturo Escobar, who's actually responsible for my being here, because I think he was invited and recommended me. So he's responsible for the maybe possibly bad talk I'm going to deliver today. But he's great nevertheless, so do not let me know. Talks of design for the pluriverse. Meaning that instead of going back, we should, he says, shift our ontology and practice, our practice of the world, if you want. Design for the pluriverse means that the designed designs, as Anne-Marie Willis puts it, what we design is designing us back and the world, and often, especially in ICT, with a vengeance. We could link this idea to the idea of cosmotechnics, which maybe you heard about previously in the morning, which is an idea put forward by Yu Kui, meaning that technology itself is producing different worlds. So different kinds of technologies are producing different worlds we then inhabit. We're producing technology, technology is producing us and the world as well. Arturo Escobar, in a recent paper published during the summer entitled On the Ontological Metrofitting of Cities, has this to say about design for the pluriverse. Designing practices based on the fundamental insights that the world does not exist out there, separate from us, but that we construct it with every one of our actions, should contribute to disrupting those worldling practices that make the world one. Making or designing pluriversally fosters forms of objectless oriented and non-representational designing that challenge the power of a globalizing economy where only one world, Western one, and one human, Westerners, fit. Such designing practices will forcefully contribute to transitioning to the pluriverse, or a world where many worlds fit, a world for many worlds, as the Zapatist says, with a multiplicity of others and all living forms. So making room for other practices, other beings, in order to foster a livable future. That's his point about designing for the pluriverse. That points towards a shift, again, towards what is desirable, what we should do, which is good, of course. But I will say, and I'm going to say in this talk, that might not be sufficient, only to turn towards what is desirable and what we should do. Can we remain inside planetary boundaries while we have already crossed 6 of them? In my opinion, with better knowledge that we are living inside what American urbanists, Stephanie Wakefield call an unsafe operating space. It does not mean reducing our imprint is optional. Science says the contrary, but that we have to take into account that we will have to deal with a future full both of technologies, ruins, scarcity, ancient dependencies, new models designed for the pluriverse, etc. A heterogeneous future. To strive towards what is desirable, we must address what is not desirable as well, as a precondition. How do we deal with models, economic models, managerial models, etc., infrastructures, supply chains, corporations that are unfit because they degrade the habitability of the earth. How do we, collectives of different scales and origins and practices, deal with the things that are valued negatively? Who cares for them? What kind of trajectory will we give them in the future? Some of these realities, which I call negative commons that we inherit, whether we want it or not, might be obvious: forsaken infrastructures, ruins, polluted soils, what I call ruined ruins, which evoke the aesthetics of the Anthropocene. If you Google Anthropocene, you will see mines, derelict infrastructures, landscapes, and the likes. There is a whole aesthetics about that. Other ruins, what I call ruinous ruins, that actively destroy the habitability of the earth, are much less conspicuous. That's why we have to politicize their status. And there, ICT comes to mind. Is that the future, or overall negative commons to which we are more and more attached in very different ways, whether it's a luxury for Westerners or a necessity for other people, such as smartphones, which are like houses for refugees, for instance. These are not links that you detach easily. Take the example again of the smartphone. I co-published a book with two colleagues, Laurent Sala and Nicolas Nova, earlier on that topic in March. And it's more and more known nowadays, and I have one, so I'm not talking for a pure position, right? I'm not moralizing here. It's more and more known, as I was saying, that smartphones are linked to proto-slavery, to extractivism, to neo-colonialism, especially in Africa, in Congo, for example, where mines are exploited in war-torn situations. And there is actually an association in Lyon that is working on this very topic. So is the smartphone representative of the future or the past? Something maybe that is too costly to exist, even though, of course, we're selling and buying more and more smartphones on a daily basis. Physicist José Alloy, who is a professor at the University of Paris, forged the concept of zombie technologies, technologies that are a zombie for two main reasons. Whence the zombie in my title. Upstream, because they depend on finite resources, or, for instance, precious metals. And we can already contemplate a time when it will be difficult, if not impossible, to maintain their production and the extraction of these resources, tendentially at least. So, should we rely from a civilizational point of view on these technologies which somehow are already dead? Whence the notion of zombie here. Downstream also, because they produce waste that cannot be absorbed through biogeochemical cycles, hence they cannot die, meaning zombie again, just as the zombie is not able to really die. So how will we inherit this legacy? Unsuited for the future. Negative commons from the past, material and immaterial negative commons, and negative commons from the future as well. Some things we have been discussing previously in the previous panel. Obsolete futures, project that will only add to the degradation of the environment. When you're researchers, how do you not do a project? Well, let me know that's not easy. And actually, they don't do that. They do the projects. Simple as that. And there is no questioning about that. And there is no institution to question that. Just an anecdote, when I was a researcher at INRIA, I attended a discussion about ecological transition and digital transition, how to think both together. And I asked my colleagues at the time, there are people among you who are working on the smart city. Who knows for which reason you are working on the smart city? No one was able to raise his or her hand. Because of course, that's not a project imagined by researchers, but by the industry. Intel, others, Cisco, but no researcher. Okay. So we lack both the knowledge not to make unnecessary or irrelevant project happen, just as we miss lots of skills and knowledge about dealing with existing negative comments. This involves new venues for research, new practices, new strategies, and the likes, and the need for new institutions as well. Now, of course, since our technologies are mostly zombie technologies, is the point I'm making to get rid of them? Absolutely not. To get rid of them all like that. The point is to learn, mixing scientific and political inquiry, what should be maintained and what should be shut down, and how, in a democratic, careful, and non-brutal fashion. When I mean non-brutal fashion, means taking into account the attachment of the people who depend on these technologies / infrastructures, of course. Unlike the way capitalism has been shutting down factories, for example, this is really not the same thing. This is precisely the work I'm doing with my colleagues, helping institutions, territories, organizations, small and big companies deal with these perspectives of activities that will have to be shut down or should be shut down. And both reasons might be relevant. A ski resort, and in France, especially ski resorts are, for some of them, shutting down, already anticipating the point when they will not be able to maintain their activities. And in other domains, they can still maintain their activities, but that's a bad idea. So we should help them shut down anyway by taking that into account and taking care of these realities. Let's take one small example. The city of Grenoble, 2 years ago, did ask us to think about its public swimming pools. That's a nice example because, I mean, everyone loves swimming pools, at least in theory. Because the city has dilapidated infrastructures that will have to be replaced, but if you do so, you end up buying newer ones, much more efficient, but with so much new services that the rebound effect strikes again, and you end up using more energy than in the past. I imagine you people know about the rebound effects already, so I don't need to talk about that. Great. Thanks. So my colleague, Diego Landiva, has been working on a protocol of renunciation where 120 citizens did an inquiry on the topic. Should we give up these infrastructures? How? Who will it affect? Plumbers, users, a lot of people in more or less obvious ways, etc. Mapping the attachment of the people to the things that will be renounced is paramount to warrant that social justice issues are put to the forefront when dealing with such issues. Some of the recommendations of the citizens involved, like keeping the functions of the infrastructures and implementing them in another infrastructure or setting, less carbon consuming, more low tech, whatever you will, were proposed. For instance, it will be possible to swim in secured water areas, but then you have to abandon your attachment to warm water, which might be acceptable. No, which will be acceptable. Thank you. Well, An interesting question I'll leave to you is whether we can do the same with digital infrastructures and services. Can we extract some of their properties and implement them in non-digital infrastructures? I imagine a lot of people here were born when the world was already digital. That's not the case for me. There was a time I didn't have a personal computer. There was a time when the university did not require me to have a personal computer. There even was a time when people did not find other people to have sex with by using a smartphone. Yes, I know, crazy shit. It opens up new areas for research and design, which could be actually quite fascinating. Take an example, very small example, very trite example. Role-playing games. We had already pen and paper RPGs. We had live action RPGs. We have video game RPGs. If the latter disappears, the video game RPG, we will simply move back to pen and paper RPGs or live action RPGs, or will we inherit some of their mechanics, some of the mechanics of video game RPGs and use them back in live action RPGs and pen and paper RPGs? It wouldn't be simply a return to the past. Or will we meet people to do whatever they accept that we do with them without using a smartphone? I'll leave that question here. Going back to the example of Grenoble, we've been working on it for 2 years already. We've been working actually on 30 similar examples. We're working on 15 examples like that every year with a real city, institution, company, collective, whatever. Almost 2 years after the start of the project, some public swimming pools in France have been shutting down because the price of gas was too high. So in the spring. So in a sense, we were working on a situation that was to be generalized a few years later. Part of our work is indeed to extract from the future relevant situations, to experiment with, to inquire, to provide answers to build tools and protocols to deal with before these situations impose themselves upon us and find ourselves unprepared. And then we can generalize the answers thus gathered to anticipate future shocks. So it's really about looking at strategic situations that we extract from the future to work on them in the present before we're in a really, really bad situation. And I can imagine thinking already about de-digitizing our civilization might not be a very bad idea to anticipate a moment when it will become mandatory. So going back to the question of the situation in the North. The fundamental question, in my view, is now about the role that the countries of the North are likely to play in the future. They bear an undisputable historical responsibility for the advent of the Anthropocene. What contribution can these countries then make? No more contribution, please. That's already too much. Several thinkers explain that it is time to go beyond the point of view of the moderns, like Bruno Latour, or their naturalism, their ontology, like Philippe Descola, the anthropologist who was formerly working at the Collège de France, or going beyond the dualism advocated, as says Arturo Escobar, by Westerners, and draw inspirations from other cosmologies, let's say other practices of the world, representation/practices of the world. Let's place it on a different trajectory altogether. In this configuration, the indigenous people see themselves recognized a preeminent role. Witnesses of a collapse that has already taken place with the conquest of America by the conquistadors, these people remain nevertheless the guardians of a way of life from which the people of the North will have much to learn. Examples of what Bruno Latour calls terrestrial peoples, neither devoid of culture nor of techniques, no more than they live in primary environments. The Amazonian forest is strongly anthropized, as researchers have shown. They will provide a source of inspiration to overcome the impasses of modernity. However, this account leaves out many issues. To begin with, it nourishes a dichotomy between indigenous people and Westerners, dismissing as nothing the former colonized people whose primary aspiration, as the Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarti rightly reminds us, was to reappropriate modernity on their own terms. Moreover, this discourse lends itself to interpretations that go in the direction of and assume, let's say, Malthusianism, seeing in the indigenous people considered sometimes as uncivilized, which is a good thing for some people, an eminently debatable reading as well, the only viable example of a way of life attuned to nature and therefore, indeed, viable to the exclusion of all others and consequently most of humanity. This discourse, in other words, says nothing about the technosphere, what some researchers call the technosphere, meaning all our infrastructures on which we depend, upon which we depend. We depend not only on the biosphere, but also on these infrastructures that we have built, and we could say that are building us. And the weight of the technosphere can no longer be circumscribed to an anomaly, to simply an artificial environment that will have to be liquidated purely and simply. The technosphere weighs more than the biosphere. So, of course, we're attached to it in a way that we cannot dispense like that. Ecology, hence, cannot be sold off as a return to nature, as a risk of carrying with it a Malthusian background. Its challenge is now to be an ecology of impure environments, in which a growing part of humanity evolves, which seeks to negotiate a narrow passage between two pitfalls: the brutal and immediate abandonment of the infrastructures, technologies, and models, again, what I call negative commons, on which a growing part of humanity depends, a little more every day, which cannot be done in the very short term. And at the same time, the maintenance of these same realities in the medium term, which is also impossible. Getting rid of everything or maintaining the business as usual models, both are impossible, and we have to find a ridge line between the two. Between the Malthusian exterminism and an exterminist carbo-fascism, there is no other choice than to keep it at equal distance and to work to carve out a passage between these two hydras. What role then for the countries of the North? The temptation is great indeed, beyond even cosmologies, to draw on the knowledge of the South generated by virtue of the crisis situation that the latter encounter. Situations that are then valued as an anticipation of future crises in the North: rising water levels, temperatures, tropicalization of the climate, etc. The indigenous peoples or the inhabitants of Haiti will thus be the scouts of the peoples of the North, taking the risk that the latter intend to protect themselves from by observing the capacity of the former to adapt. A very paradoxical logic when it comes to eliminating the causes which, by degrading the conditions of the countries of the South today, will affect and already affect those of the North tomorrow, today and tomorrow. Should we then reverse this logic of scouting in order to see the changeover take place in the North? It is a question of, is it a question of competing for the place of the vanguard or the avant-garde in the face of a catastrophe that is no longer an event, but a rapid and continuous degradation of the conditions of habitability of the Earth? There is, however, a way to go beyond this sterile opposition based on the notion of heritage or legacy. Those who point to the responsibility of the countries of the North tend to reject the word Anthropocene and to substitute it with others like Capitalocene, Anglocene, Androcene, etc. There are more than 100 variations. We can accept this historical responsibility without giving in to all the arguments of the promoters of the Capitalocene. However, one point seems decisive to me. Far from being an avant-garde, we must think of the North as the bearer and witness of obsolete futures, which, as Indian writers Amitav Ghosh points out, were never intended to happen on a truly global scale. No artifice will allow a generalization of the Californian way of life to the entire population of the world, to take an archetypal example despite its fundamental harmfulness. If these futures are obsolete, it is then a question of inheriting both their past materialization and the projects that still happen every day in their name, especially in the field of research, of course. To inherit from the past as well as to inherit from the future in the same gesture. This is the meaning of the work we have been doing for the past 5 years with my colleagues, Emmanuel Bonnet and Diego Londiva, whom I mentioned already. Based on the principle that no transition can be accomplished simply by greening the existing realities, existing technologies, and in addition, that not everything can be maintained in order to guarantee the conditions of habitability on Earth. The ecological redirection poses the need to proceed to democratic arbitration and explicit renunciations, which will not be the same everywhere and everyone, because if we collectively inherit the infrastructures of what the philosopher Olufemi Taiwo calls the global racial empire, there are, of course, many discrepancies between people inside this empire. The current situation can therefore be thought of in the following way: how to change the trajectory of models, economic, distributive, legal, managerial, infrastructures, technology that again destroy the habitability of the world. To do this, once again, we have to recognize them for what they are. True negative commons, whose first task is a collective reappropriation at multiple scales. A major pitfall must be avoided. The populations attached voluntarily or involuntarily to these realities are increasingly numerous in the North as well as in the global South. And despite the immense heterogeneity of situations, they cannot extract themselves from them and get rid of them overnight. At the same time, as I said, business as usual is excluded in the medium term. The challenge again is to walk this fine line between these two pitfalls. It is here that the historical roles of the nation and people of the North must be affirmed. Yes, it is indeed a question of extending the thread opened by the Industrial Revolution and what the geographer Benoit Devion calls the mining metabolic regime, meaning that we happen to get our energy from under the surface of the earth, which was something quite new at the time. Pulling the thread is not tantamount to positioning oneself as the vanguard of the world to come. As I said, a role that is generally assigned to indigenous populations or to the nation on the verge of being swallowed up by the oceans, populations that are the bridgeheads of the changes brought about by the Anthropocene, a resilient vanguard despite themselves for the nations of the North, eager to make the most of the lessons thus gleaned. I'm almost done. Rather, Northerners should embrace becoming a rearguard, caught in the past, struggling with a heritage that they must confront in order to allow other countries to represent the vanguard of tomorrow and to negotiate in their own terms with this impossible modernity, drawing inspirations as they wish from the arts of closure that it is imperative to experiment with in the North. Not to ask others to be our pilot fish, not to wait, but to allow these bifurcations, at the same time political and technical, setting the first example without expecting a return on investment or a competitive advantage. In the North, the good life from now on is the one that will take charge of these realities, these negative comments, and work to dismantle them. No more, no less. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexandre, for this very interesting talk. Yeah, maybe raise your hand if you want to ask a question. We have one over there. Where should we also go? Here? Okay, two. Okay, well, let's start with the one in the middle here, up there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, you talked about the need for a democratic way of choosing what we get rid of. And you also mentioned that there's an increasing population and that is attached to, in the end, what we'll need to get rid of. So do you have any idea, any lead on the way to do so, to organize this democratic debate, as it will sure get really emotional at some point?
Sure, it's mainly depends on the meaning of democracy you put forward here. There is, of course, this idea that it's very difficult to be attached to democracy and tackle these issues because it takes time, because people are emotional, because it will be very hard, and also because for legitimate reasons, people are really attached to things we have to get rid of. So that creates lots of difficulties, right? So from this perspective, I agree, it will be very difficult. There's also this idea that, I think I mentioned it already, but it takes too much time. So why be a Democrat when you can be an autocrat, right? And deal without the need to use democracy. But I think this is a bad argument because autocratic regimes are not especially known to really tackle these environmental issues in general. Often react too late, and when it's too late, of course, it's easy to be an autocrat because there is no other way to go, right? But actually, what I think is there is this other understanding of democracy put forward by American, well, US philosopher John Dewey, who was one of the most important pragmatist philosophers. And he linked democracy to the capacity of identifying issues and tackling them and doing inquiries. And in my work on a daily basis, I see collectives, whether they are collectives of people, associations, but also corporations, companies, public institutions who are facing some issues and they don't know how to deal with them. And the point, and this is what I said at the mid part of my talk, is to precisely look at these situations, extract them, to work on them, to provide answers right now, so that then after that, we can generalize those answers. For example, the work that has been done in Grenoble showed that people with the right protocols and the right conditions, they are able to democratically inquire and reflect about renunciation. The people in the city of Grenoble thought it wouldn't be possible, that renunciation was a bad word and should be advertised as such. But the word was used and people were able to work in democratic fashion with this setting. So here we have a democracy that is much more active, much more embodied. And we see a lot of, again, corporations, collectives everywhere facing these issues, and we have to accompany them, we have to help them, we have to build some new tools in order for them to face these situations, and by experimenting in some place, to be able to experiment at a much bigger scale later on. The work we have been doing with Grenoble, there are many other public institutions which are interested in that because they thought it wasn't possible in the past to do some democratic deliberation and inquiry on these issues. And they're interested because precisely they're facing the same questions. So with this understanding of democracy, it's very much possible to advance. We've, of course, democracy understood as simply the electoral regime where you vote every 5 years. Of course, it's very difficult.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation here. Yeah. In relation with the panel we had before, I wonder if you had reflection about the digitalization of research, because to be honest, I cannot imagine what my PhD would look like if I had not used my computer. And as well, in regard of the panel, I remember that digitalization was often quoted as a way to open science to more participation from the society. So how would you address as well this issue in regard of the digitalization of science?
Well, that's a huge question. Of course, my answer will be way too trite and short, but I will say first, joking a little bit, but don't feel threatened. We're not there yet. Digitization is strong and doing very well. So if we simply allow ourselves to think about what will be de-digitization in the future, that's not basically threatening anyone. It's more because, and I'm not naive, you know, I'm not some people who are technocritic or technophobic. They really strive for abandoning everything that is digital at once. I don't think that will happen, right? I'm not. But at the same time, I think we will de-digitize once we've reached the point when we are fully digitized, and that will be very bad, a very bad situation, right? So we have to allow ourselves, again, to extract some aspect of the future, importing them in the present, and to think about these issues right now, to anticipate as much as possible what will happen. But I mean, I love, I don't think we'll be able to be fully digitized, as I explained, but I have, I don't know, 4,000 games on Steam, and so I'm fully digitized myself, right? So I'm not talking from a moralizing, again, point of view. I think that's important. And regarding what you were saying, yeah, that's very important, because when I did my PhD, actually, there was, that really sounds like an old man talking, but when Web 2.0 was happening, no one remembers what Web 2.0 is, or you do, and then you can guess my age, which is quite a shame. And indeed, there was an optimism at the time about the possibilities of technology. Actually, it was a great time to live under such circumstances. I don't think we will see such optimism anytime soon. So it was good in a sense, even though it was probably a bit naive. And at the same time, we saw the possibilities of these technologies, but it was also a time when the platforms were emerging and, you know, using these possibilities for themselves. So yes, it was open, but it was open for them. So it was closed, in fact, but it had the look of openness. And probably the threshold here was the disappearance of the RSS feed, which was kind of a symbolic of a shift towards a complete different web, a web of platforms whereas previously the web had been the open platform itself. So it's true now that this openness is often naive even in science, and that a lot of open science measures that are taken look, and to me and other people and colleagues, and actually we have been working on a commission about that this year with some people at INRIA Grenoble. So it's a bit secret for the moment, but I will be happy to share the results later on. yes, this movement towards openness is put forward and advocated by neoliberal governments, like in France. So why is that the case? What has shifted, and what is the real value of this openness? Yeah, so we have indeed to question this, and there are, for example, some licenses of reciprocity, which are thought to be closed licenses from point of view of the people who advocate really open licenses, but they might be more interested to inquire for the future than indeed this neoliberal openness that we have right now inside our institutions. So yeah, so I won't talk too much about that, but glad to exchange on this topic. We have something that will be an initiative that will be revealed in a few weeks. So.
Waiting for it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hello. So thank you for your presentation. I think that in your book, Héritage et Fermeture, you talk about the smartphones as being one of the zombie technologies of the future. So it was very interesting for me and for my future thesis. So could you expand, because it seems like very far away from now, and could you expand and could you tell us what do you think and how do you think we are going to digitalize ourselves or our world in regards to the smartphone?
Well, that's a very good question. What I was trying to convey in this part of the book was indeed that in a kind of discussion with the late Bernard Stiegler, for whom I have been working for 3 years when I was a PhD student, that the smartphone was not a pharmacon. So a pharmacon is both poison and remedy, right? You take it to poison someone, or you take it as a remedy because you have been poisoned by yourself. And the saying goes, this is something has been advocating, that technology is not bad or good nor neutral, but it's a pharmacon. It's both bad and good, and it's kind of the use you make of it that will make it good or bad. But there is always the danger of it being bad or it being good. And I was saying that this might be the case somehow, but not completely, because the examples he takes are examples linked to the use of these technologies. Of course, the smartphone is now destroying my attention, taking my data, opening up to a very dystopian future. I don't use it for that reason, but maybe you are using like that, deciding who you will have sex with, which might not be a very good idea to leave that to an algorithm. But anyway, that's not my point to judge. So all these crazy stuff it's doing, which are not necessarily good. And Bernard was saying, maybe we can imagine social networks that will not destroy your attention. Maybe you can imagine other practices and develop a kind of ecology of practice, as some would say, around these technologies. And that is very much needed because these technologies are here to stay. And they exist, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm not all against that, right? We can devise this ecology of practices in order to inherit these technologies. And I have some, so it will be better if it would not destroy my attention and yours and people here. But at the same time, what I'm saying is that this concerns the people who are using these technologies and says nothing about the people who are producing these technologies. And even if the smartphone is pharmaconed, if you will, if you make a remedy out of the poison, that will not change the destiny of the people in Congo who are extracting the ore in war-torn areas in absolutely horrific circumstances. And that we should think about that and think about the ecological viability of them. But again, it's not a moralizing point. I'm not saying we should abandon them immediately. It will be horrible as well for me to say that of the refugees for whom the smartphone is a house, is a recipient of their identity. So we should look at, well, inherit all these dimensions. And my point is that the pharmacon framework is ignoring some of them, and that we have to embrace all of them. So yeah, that's
I think we have like one more question, right? So that's unless someone shouts now.
I have
think
maybe
we-
one as well after. if it's
Okay,
fine.
so yeah, maybe we can condense them into 3 minutes.
Okay, so thank you for your talk. You talked about democracy as the ability of a population to identify problems and tackle them, with the example of the city of Grenoble, which is a local community. In this context, do you think we need to broadcast these problems and potential solutions, as they are not the same worldwide? And if so, how do you broadcast them and make them accepted?
Well, it's a good question. I certainly think that the experiments that we are doing should be, for strategic reasons, generalized. But at the same time, I'm not saying that they can be exported as they are to different settings. I think that the example can be inspiring. Some tools can be very useful for other people facing the same problem or a similar problem or a comparable problem. But at the same time, we have also to still do some inquiries, not use those tools as if they were automatic, right? And automatically providing answers. But we have to understand the minute details and attachments of every situation. We're working with ski resorts and the situations that different ski resorts and territories are facing. That might be the disappearance of the snow and the crumbling of the mountains, but at the same time, there are very different contexts, and you have to really go look at each situation to understand what is at play. So it's a kind of in between you're producing tools, you make them available, but at the same time, you have to always remember that you don't have an automatic methodology or tools that will do all the job for you.
Thank you a lot for the talk. I have a question about time, I would say, because you were talking about future, like extracting, I would say, a part of future, then bring them back, trying to understand, generalize it. So it's a bit like past, present, future thing. And so that makes me think to the like time constant and like the time we have not left. That's not what I mean, but like we know that we have a huge inertia in the system, in our society, to change. At least that's the way I see it, like institutions, that kind of stuff. That might sound like a higher level question, but what do you think of this inertia? Even if you extract part from the future, then you can generalize this. Do you think we are in a context that needs to break at some point such that you can change, like super high entropy, and then you can do different things? Or do you think we can say, okay, this is an example, we should aim towards this and start anticipating and changing now? So
I'm not advocating a kind of ecological Leninism like Andreas Malm, for instance, because I don't think a global revolution will happen immediately. And I think the kind of global revolution he imagined is very viralistic, and that's might not be the kind of stuff we need right now. I think I used to say it's a quip, but I like it. It doesn't go as fast as we would like, but faster than we imagine. Imagine what happened like 5 years ago when we were talking about planes and flying. There was almost no controversy about that simple fact. And now flying through planes has become really representative of the inequalities around the world, of an activity that only some people are able to afford, and that weighs way too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than it should for that reason. So I think we're still witnessing a kind of acceleration, right? That we should strategically use this acceleration to go in the right direction, and that we should also observe all the contradictions of the system, whether, and that's, I think, something that is shared, for example, by the late Eric Colin Wright, who's an American sociologist. He's been working a book, French title is Anti-Capitalist Strategies for the 21st Century. And it's a good book because that's an example of anti-capitalist book, which is non-viralistic at the same time. Like not pretending, you know, it's a war and I'm gonna win it. Yeah, sure. And identifying these contradictions is good. And the fact that we witness contradiction on a daily basis is good. Otherwise, what we will witness will be the business as usual. So, for example, in France, the territories get money from letting companies build new houses, and it's destroying land, of course, artificializing land. And at the same time, they promote a new law. The authorities are promoting a new law that forbids that. And now they have this contradiction and they don't know how to do, what to do and how to operate. So we should look and anticipate when these contradictions will happen in order to be ready to wait in the right way and, you know, opposite to the business as usual side. So, and that can happen in, well, everywhere, even in research, harder in research, because that's really a difficult setting. But it happens everywhere in all domains. And I think research can be useful for that. Researchers are always, through their work, identifying problems. But the thing is, they don't identify strategies to act upon these problems. Take a book against capitalism. It will be 400 pages long of diagnosis, and then 25 pages really badly written because it's a mandatory part about what should be done, but really crappy stuff. What we should have is 400 pages diagnosis, 400 pages second volume of strategy. And we don't have that currently, but we should strive for that.
Okay, we're out of time at the end of the talk. So thank you so much, Alexandre.
Thank you very much.